Welcome to our recorded lecture on the development of Christianity in early Africa. And since I am dependent on my notes, I will be looking down and reading from my notes from time to time. But this might be the most efficient delivery system in the limited amount of time that we have. So let me begin by outlining the various objectives that I want you as students, us as participants in this, to get out of this lecture. First, I expect that as a result of this lecture, the student will describe the cultures that developed around Africa's two leading cities. Secondly, the student should be able to explore how those cultures shaped the thinkers from those cities. And third, the student will evaluate how those cultures produced a uniquely African Christianity. But before we get to some of those issues, let me start by surveying the role that Africa played in the Bible. The drama of God's Word involved Africa even before Jesus. One of the first mentions of Africa is in Genesis 41 when Joseph was made a ruler in Egypt. We read in the book of Exodus that Moses spent some time in Africa, that Moses married an Ethiopian woman that made Miriam and Aaron upset. And some people have interpreted this as racial bias on the part of Miriam and Aaron. And that may have played a part, but it also may have something to do with the non-Israelite status of Zipporah. That even as far back as Moses, Africa was a part of God's work of redemption, in this case in the life of Moses. We read that David had an affair with Bathsheba. Bathsheba meaning daughter of Sheba. In other words, a daughter of a noblewoman from Africa, right? Solomon in 1 Kings 10 had a visit from the Queen of Sheba. We also read about Egypt in the Psalms, that Psalm 68:31, envoys will come out of Egypt. Cush will submit herself to God. And this is exactly what happened. Even in the New Testament, we read that Jesus spent some time in Africa. After Jesus' death and resurrection, Philip, in Acts chapter 8, meets this Ethiopian eunuch, a servant of Queen Candace, on the road to Gaza, reading the book of Isaiah. In other words, Africans had the Word of God even as far back as the days of the apostles, right? And this eunuch accepts Christ and is baptized and presumably sent back to his homeland in Africa, representing the gospel being spread into Africa. So, Africa's role in God's history of redemption didn't start with the 19th century modern missions movement. It didn't even start with 16th century visits from traders or merchants. It didn't even start with some of the apologists or the early church fathers. It actually started as far back as Genesis. I think that is important to keep in mind as we go through this lecture. So let me talk about how, after Jesus, how the gospel spread into Africa. And the first instance I'm going to talk about, or the first location I'm going to talk about, is the Kingdom of the Maghreb. And I'll be honest, I don't 100% know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it involved two cities which embraced Christianity. Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. Alexandria was a Greek city where Greek philosophy and culture were taught. It's named after Alexander the Great, the guy who tried to spread Hellenism, Greek culture throughout the world. And as a result of its Greek ties, it used the Greek language, and it was tied very closely with the Eastern Church and with Greek philosophical modes of thought, let's just say. Second city that was significant in Africa very early on was Carthage. And Carthage was also on the north shore of Africa. And it was mainly a Roman city, a Latin-based city. And instead of having a philosophical culture, it had more of a legal culture. So as a result, it tended to engage more with Roman writing, Roman brands of the Christian faith, as opposed to Greek or Eastern brands of the Christian faith. And one of the earliest Christians we read about in Africa is a guy named Clement of Alexandria. And he lived from about AD 150 to 215. Clement was very pro-philosophy. He was very Greek in his outlook. And he thought that philosophy was given to the Christians in order to lead them to Christ, just as the law was given to the Jews. So Clement didn't think there was any ultimate conflict between Greek philosophy and Christianity. Both were a means to point people to Christ. Now, Clement did not see Christ as much of a shepherd as a teacher. And Clement self-consciously called Christians to study philosophy. For Clement, studying philosophy is something that makes one a better Christian, right? We talk about a second thinker, African thinker from the early church father area, a guy named Tertullian. We talked about both these guys when we talked about the apologists. Now we'll think about them in terms of African thinkers. Tertullian was based in Carthage, and he lived almost at the exact time. He was born in 155, lived to about 220. And because he was in Carthage, Tertullian was more of a lawyer. He thought and wrote within a Roman legal context. And he actually rejected Clement's idea that a Christian will become a better Christian through philosophy. He famously said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, what does philosophy have to do with Christianity, right? A third African Christian that we don't spend enough time talking about in this course is a guy named Athanasius. He lived from 296 to 373 and is a monumental figure in Christianity in general and reflects some of the tension that we see between Clement and Tertullian. Athanasius was a champion of Nicene orthodoxy, attended the Council of Nicaea, and when the political mood of the empire was trying to drag the church back towards Arianism, Athanasius was obviously not the only one, but sometimes seemed like the only one holding firm the Nicene faith, right? And as a result, he was repeatedly exiled by the emperor and ended up coming in contact with these desert fathers, the Hermetic monks out in the desert, right? And one of the first things he wrote, maybe the most popular thing he wrote, was a biography of St. Anthony, one of these desert fathers. And this was something of a class critique, right? That Athanasius understood the role that these desert fathers played in the Christian faith. Christianity, according to Athanasius, was not the reign of the social elites, right? The normative Christian for Athanasius was a lower class, possibly a monk, everyday Egyptian, right? So south of Alexandria, south of this center of Greek learning, was an area called Skete, a monastic center in Egypt. And not only did Anthony, a famous Hermetic monk, come from Egypt, another monk came from Egypt, a guy named Pachyomus, who was one of the earliest Kenobetic monks, or monks that lived within a community. Let me try that again. The third Christian that we're going to talk about from Africa was a guy named Athanasius. He lived between AD 296 and AD 373, so a generation or so after Clement and Alexander. But he still wrestled with some of the same tensions. And Athanasius is monumentally important, and we don't spend enough time talking about him. But let me discuss 2 or 3 things that made him monumentally important. First was Athanasius's involvement in monasticism. Now, I don't think Athanasius was ever a monk himself, but he was repeatedly exiled by the emperor for holding to Nicene orthodoxy, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when he was exiled, he came into contact with desert fathers, such as a guy named St. Anthony. And maybe one of the most influential writings Athanasius engaged in was this biography of St. Anthony that kind of extolled the virtues of hermetic monasticism, the idea of asceticism, being alone and going without. And this biography of St. Anthony was a tremendous catalyst to the development of monasticism for generations. Interestingly enough, Egypt itself played a role beyond Athanasius' biography, because not only was Anthony this Hermetic monk from Egypt, so was Pachomius, one of the earliest Canobetic monks, in other words, monks that lived in community. And while there was no corresponding biography that would serve as the catalyst to communal monasticism, it also had its roots in Africa, in Egypt. Now, a second reason why Athanasius is so influential was his involvement in promoting orthodoxy. So Athanasius, I believe he was present at the Council of Nicaea, but after the Council of Nicaea that excluded an Arian understanding of the Trinity, there were several politicians, and yes, several bishops as well, that still held to Arianism. Theologians like Eusebius of Nicomedia continued to be Arian. And then when Constantine's son, Constans II, came to power, he was Arian and started to promote Arianism, tried to exclude Nicene orthodoxy. And Athanasius was having none of it. And there are some very entertaining stories around Athanasius here. Honestly, I'm not sure how true they are, but they have the ring of truth when you know who Athanasius was. One story was Athanasius going to the emperor in Constantinople, and the emperor wouldn't see him. So Athanasius went back behind the palace and hung out near the stables. And when the emperor would go out riding his horse, he would grab onto the bridle, and the emperor dragged him for however long until he finally agreed to an audience with Athanasius. Probably my favorite story is an exile of Athanasius's, where he had to sail south up the Nile into the desert, and the emperor changed his mind from an exile to an execution. So he sent a band of Roman soldiers to capture him, to execute him. And as Athanasius sees these Roman soldiers coming close, the soldiers yell out, "Hey, we're looking for the Bishop Athanasius." And Athanasius replies, "Oh yes, I've seen him, and if you hurry, you can catch him." I don't know how true those are. I really hope they're true, because they're great stories. But even when politically it seemed like the empire was wandering back towards Arianism, Athanasius was adamant about Nicene orthodoxy, about this understanding of the Trinity that saw Christ as fully God and co-equal of one substance with the Father. And that was the subject of his book on the Incarnation, which survives until today. Maybe another area that identifies Athanasius as someone special in history was his leadership. And during one of his many exiles, he was hiding out in Upper Egypt, which, remember, is south because the Nile flows north, right? And he interacted with many Christians who began to look to him to guidance. So he was kind of an unintentional missionary bishop to some of the African churches that were south of Egypt. And one such man that looked to Athanasius for guidance was a guy named Frumentius. And he was a Syrian youth who was ordained as a missionary, ordained by Athanasius as a missionary to Axum, or Ethiopia. So even in the 3rd and 4th century AD, we see the extension of the Christian church south in Africa here. The 4th Christian figure from Africa in the early church is St. Augustine. And he lived a generation or so after Athanasius, from 354 to 430. And we will have spent an entire class on Augustine, so we're not going to discuss him here. But when we talk about the transplantation of Christianity into North Africa, into the kingdom of the Maghreb, we're talking about a Christian culture that was kind of torn between Greek philosophical thinking and Roman legal thinking. And it was decidedly Nicene, decidedly anti-Arian, that had placed a great value on the development of monasticism and played an important role in the spread of Christianity outside the Maghreb. Second kingdom we're going to talk about is the kingdom of Nubia. And Catherine of Sikki claims that the Ethiopian eunuch Philip encountered was from a Nubian city called Meroe, right? Honestly, I am not 100% sure where she gets that from, but she seems pretty certain about it, so that's why I cited her by name. And in the 4th century, Axum, what we call Ethiopia today, conquered Nubia, creating what Isiki identified as Bala culture. And in Nubia, Christianity was known, but it was not embraced on the same scale that it would be in Egypt or Axum. But by the 6th century, Christianity was starting to grow more rapidly in Nubia. And the Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire sent missionaries from Constantinople in the 7th century. In the 8th century, there was the construction of the Pharos Cathedral. So they started to put in architectural infrastructure around the Christian faith in Nubia. But this is much later than Egypt or Axum. This is 8th century. If you want to know what the Cathedral of Pharos looks like, look at your syllabus. And the picture I have on the front is from the cathedral in Pharos. Now, this does not tell us that Christianity took root in Nubia early on, but it does tell us that Christianity in Africa persisted. It took root very early in Egypt, and it persisted so that it grew in an area like Nubia between the 6th and the 8th century. The next African kingdom we're going to talk about is the kingdom of Axum. And Axum is modern-day Ethiopia. The Christian philosopher Meropius traveled to India with his ward Frumentius, who we've already met, and Idesius. Now, Meropius was killed by pirates in the Red Sea, and the kids were brought into the court of King Ella Amida of Axum, right? Idesius became the king's cupbearer, and Frumentius his treasurer and secretary. Now, Frumentius acted as regent to the king's son upon Ella Amida's death. And about this time, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, met with Athanasius, or not all the way to Alexandria, but at least north into southern Egypt, where Athanasius was hiding out, and informed him of the need in Axum. And Athanasius commissioned him as bishop. And this was corroborated by a letter from Emperor Constantius, who wrote the king of Axum, encouraging him to appoint an Arian bishop, right? Because Constantius was Arian. But through the work of Frumentius and Idesius, Axum became a Nicene Christian nation because of Athanasius's influence there, as evidenced by the coins and monuments of Enzana, the king of Axum. And at the beginning of Enzana's reign, his coins and monuments extolled the Babylonian gods. But by the end, they were thoroughly Christian, even incorporating Trinitarian symbolism, right? So in the slides, I do show a couple of coins. And the first coin shows the crescent on the front. This is before Islam. So this would be the Babylonian moon god Sin, right? But the second coin that we see has the king holding a cross. So numismatic evidence actually traces Axum's conversion from Babylonian-style paganism to Christianity. Now, also very early on in the church, Syria, through people like Frumentius, invested in the Christian life of Axum by sending 9 saints in the 5th century. And these are the 9 saints that are depicted on the ceiling of the Abuna Yamata Cave Church that we looked at. So we've already seen the beginning of the development of a uniquely African Christianity. Since Alexandria was Greek, therefore philosophical, and Carthage was Roman, therefore legal, I think it is proper to ask the question, well, was there an African Christianity that wasn't either Greek, wasn't Roman, that wasn't like a mixture of Greek and Roman, a tertium quid, if you will? And I think with the Donatist controversy, we start to see this African-style Christianity emerge. Now, if you remember back to our lecture on the persecution of Christians, when Decian persecuted Christians, when this persecution came to Carthage, the bishop of Carthage, Cyprian, fled to the desert, and he drew criticism from some of the Roman Christians because the Roman bishop had stood and was willing to be martyred for his faith. But Cyprian fled. Now, Cyprian had a good reason to flee. He said, look, how am I supposed to lead and guide my people under persecution if I'm dead? So he felt like he needed to go to a place of safety in order to guide the church through a time of persecution. But still, Roman leaders such as Fabius and eventually Novatian criticized Cyprian for this act. And when the persecution ended, the church had to negotiate how they readmitted these lapsed members. And we've talked about this in a previous lecture. How did the church negotiate the problem of the lapsy, as we called it? Well, the Novatian controversy of the 3rd century gave way to the Donatist controversy in the 4th century. And by the 4th century, Constantine was in power. Christianity was not only legal, but was the favored religion. And under these circumstances, what do you do with the traditores? What do you do with the lapsi, the people that handed over their Bibles, right? Now that Christianity was legal and favored, North Africa flocked to Christianity. If you wanted to move up in the imperial structure, you had to be a Christian. So now Christianity became more diverse than just a working class religion. And the reasoned approach that was taken by Cornelius in the 3rd century was actually challenged in North Africa. A man named Caecilian was elected bishop of Carthage in AD 311, about the same time that Constantine became emperor. But Punic and Berbers in North Africa didn't think he was rigorous enough. They also thought he was too Roman. And they elected their own parallel bishop, Bishop Majorinus. And Majorinus died quickly, and a guy named Donatus replaced him. This is where we get the term Donatist controversy. And this deepened the initial schism when the empire was just beginning to rally around Christianity. And now we had rival bishops in Carthage. Unsurprisingly, Constantine, the emperor, recognized only Caecilian, right? The Romanly appointed bishop, right? North Africa resented Roman interference in African affairs. But not only was this a theological schism, it was a cultural schism as well. Because the Donatist party thought of power differently than the Romans. The Donatist party thought that a more rigorous scrutiny had to be applied to the lapsee in order to readmit them into the faith. They also thought that African affairs should be dealt with by Africans. And the root difference here is how Africans and Romans viewed authority. Because Romans thought authority was vested in institutions. Like if the emperor appoints someone, then their authority is based on this imperial representation, this imperial implementation. If the emperor says it, it goes, right? Africans didn't look at authority that way. The Berber and Punic cultures in North Africa had a different way of looking at authority. And they thought authority was based more on personal character, or in Christian terms, in holiness, right? It is holiness that gives a bishop his authority. And one's personal holiness determined how much authority they had. So if Carthage, these Berber and Punic North Africans, did not accept the authority of the Roman Caecilian, then anyone ordained by him or baptized by him was not considered properly ordained or baptized. Now we can see not just two different leaders in the church, but two different church institutions and cultures emerging in North Africa, right? And these two churches had two different bases of authority. The Romans were based in this institutional authority derived from the Roman emperor. And the North African church, the Donatist church, had a base of authority in one's personal holiness or character, right? And these lines ended up being drawn largely ethnically or economically, pitting the Roman upper classes in North Africa against the Punic and Berber working classes. And this schism unfortunately led the Donatists to resort to violence to promote their church and to support their bishop. And one can only imagine that it elicited a more extreme response from the Roman Empire and from the emperor himself. But this wasn't a mere political movement. It wasn't a social class conflict at its core. At its core, it was a theological conflict. And it's revived the question that we've touched on and we haven't wrestled with fully about how the church relates to the state. And we've talked in previous lectures about how the church operated as a minority religion within the Roman Empire. And we talked about how they did so intellectually, right? The apologists, they had to give a defense of this Christian faith in a pagan society, right? We talked about how the Christians had to negotiate being a minority politically, and how persecution and even martyrdom became a good thing in the Christian church. It was a mark of a Christian there. Now the ground is shifted. Now Christianity is not only legal, it's favored. And eventually it would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. So now we have the development of a new Christian culture in the Roman Empire. And as we've seen in this lecture, while we have a Christianity developing in Africa that was rooted in both Greek philosophy, Roman legal thought, it's now also developing a uniquely African flavor to it. Now, some scholars like to talk about Christianities, plural, that there's no one Christianity. There are many Christianities there. Yeah, I don't like that language. I push against it. Because as we look at how the Christian faith was transplanted from a Jewish context to a Gentile, from a Gentile context into a Roman minority context, from a Roman minority context into a Roman majority context. And now we see Christianity developing in Asian contexts and African contexts. I think it's appropriate to talk about the differences between those, like the differences in the base of power between how Romans, the legal thinkers, think about it, and the personal character base that an African might bring to the table. But we should also look at what things stayed the same. their commitment to the scriptures, their commitment to Nicene orthodoxy, so on and so forth, evangelism, missions, prayer, baptism, Lord's Supper. I think there's good reason to see more unity between African Christianity and Roman Christianity than differences, while at the same time acknowledging, yeah, there were differences. So I appreciate your patience here, and we will discuss the idea of transplantation further in class. Thank you.